You look at the corporate angle, Facebook, JP Morgan, and other businesses, they're busy distancing themselves from President Trump and lawmakers who supported his claims of election fraud. Former Republican presidential candidate Carly Fiorina spoke with Bloomberg's Vonnie Quinn on how corporate America should react to what's been happening in Washington.
Well, let us start by saying the business community must respond, must react. Silence is no longer an option, honestly, in my view, because silence is assent. And I think that's why you see so many corporations stepping out, either in word or in deed, as you mentioned, in terms of cutting off PAC checks. You know, this first started when Trump and others continued to say the election was a fraud. You saw members of the business community speak up. And then I think last week truly is viewed as what it was, an assault not only on our Capitol, but on our democratic institutions and our democracy. And so when you have something that is so indefensible and unacceptable, silence is no longer an option. I think the difficulty for the business community, the difficulty for technology companies as well, is there was a lot of silence up until this point. Silence as things happened that clearly were pointing in this direction. President Trump was calling this election rigged and a fraud for at least 9 months. President Trump tweeted, "Liberate Michigan," and applauded when people with assault rifles assaulted the Capitol in Lansing, Michigan. In other words, this has been building. And the business community's silence during that build will get examined, although their actions now are surely welcomed.
I mean, is there a downside for business to calling out the president by name here? It would seem like some of them resisted doing that. And also, is it enough to withhold some campaign contributions?
Yeah. Well, of course, there is a downside. There's a downside in inciting the wrath of the Republican Party. Many businesses count on the less regulation, less taxation platform of the Republican Party, and so they don't want to get on the wrong side of people who actually do things that they feel are helpful to their business. Of course there's a downside. But I think as well there's a real downside in not doing anything, because last week was so universally horrific that I think what these companies would find is, if they continued their silence, that the downside from their employees, the downside from their customers, the downside from their suppliers would outweigh the risk of perhaps irking some in the Republican Party.
Amazon has been sued by Parler over its decision to kick Parler off AWS. And of course, this comes on the heels of Apple also deciding to get rid of Parler from its App Store. Tech companies are finally making a stance in a variety of ways. Is this the right decision on the part of Amazon and on the part of Apple?
Well, you know, I think the technology companies clearly had to do something with these platforms. I think the issue is it is long overdue for the technology companies and their executives to acknowledge that this is bigger than them. You know, the technology companies have been hauled up onto Capitol Hill a variety of times, and each time the CEOs have taken a very defensive posture. They basically said, leave us alone, we've got this, we'll figure out the rules of the road. Well, that's obviously insufficient. And it's insufficient because these platforms have become our public squares. And so you cannot expect politicians to keep their hands off. What I've been advocating for a long time is these technology companies now need to do the hard work and the heavy lifting of sitting down with both sides of the aisle and laying out rules of the road that they're willing to live by, rules of the road that are transparent, rules of the road that apply to all of these platforms. Because without that now, there are always going to be some people who say, I don't trust them. And oh, by the way, that's a lot of power in the hands of a single chief executive to make a decision whenever he or she chooses.
The biggest stories the moment they happen from around the globe. Subscribe to Bloomberg Quick Take now for insight in an instant.